Hi guys! Today we're going to start reading a chapter book, Dealing with Dragons. This is one of my absolute favorites. My older sister read it to me, and now I'm going to read it to you guys. It follows Cimarine, a princess who refuses to be proper. She's everything a princess is not supposed to be: headstrong, tomboyish, smart, and bored. She runs away to befriend a dragon, duel some wizards, and meet some interesting characters along the way. So let's get started. Dealing with Dragons by Patricia C. Wrede. Chapter 1, in which Cimarine refuses to be proper and has a conversation with a frog. Linderwall was a large kingdom just east of the Mountains of Mourning, where philosophers were highly respected and the number 5 was fashionable. The climate was unremarkable, and the knights kept their armor brightly polished, mainly for show. It had been centuries since a dragon had come east. There were the usual periodic problems with royal children and uninvited fairy godmothers, but they were always the sort of thing that could be cleared up by finding the proper prince or princess to marry the unfortunate child a few years later. All in all, Linderwall was a very prosperous and pleasant place. Cimarine hated it. Cimarine was the youngest daughter of the king of Linderwall, and her parents found her rather trying. Their first 6 daughters were perfectly normal princesses, with long golden hair and sweet dispositions, each more beautiful than the last. Cimarine was lovely enough, but her hair was jet black, and she always wore it in braids instead of curled and pinned like her sisters. And she wouldn't stop growing. Her parents were quite sure that no prince would want to marry a girl who could look him in the eye instead of gazing up at him becomingly through her lashes. As for the girl's disposition, well, when people were being polite, they said she was strong-minded, and when they were angry or annoyed with her, they said she was stubborn as a pig. The king and queen did the best they could. They hired the most superior tutors and governesses to teach her dancing, embroidery, drawing, and etiquette, all the things a princess ought to know. There was a great deal of etiquette, from the proper way to curtsy before a visiting prince, to how loudly it was permissible to scream when being carried off by a giant. Linderwall still had occasional problems with giants. And Cimarine found it all very dull, but she pressed her lips together and learned it anyways, and when she couldn't stand it any longer she would go down to the castle armory and bully the arms master into giving her a fencing lesson. As she got older she found her regular lessons more and more boring. Consequently, the fencing lessons became more and more frequent. When she was 12 her father found out. "Fencing is not proper behavior for a princess," he told her, in the gentle but firm voice recommended by the court philosopher. Cimarine tilted her head to one side. "Why not?" "Well, it's simply not done." Cimarine considered. "Aren't I a princess?" "Of course you are, my dear," her father said with relief. He'd been bracing himself for a storm of tears, which is the way his other daughters reacted to his reprimands. "Well, I fence," Cimarine said, with an air of one delivering an unshakable argument, "so it is too done by a princess." "That doesn't make it proper, dear," her mother put in gently. "Why not?" "It simply doesn't," the queen said firmly, and that was the end of Cimarine's fencing lessons. When she was 14 her father discovered that she was making the court magician teach her magic. "How long has this been going on?" he asked wearily, when she arrived in response to his summons. "Since you stopped my fencing lessons," Cimarine said. "I suppose you're going to tell me this isn't proper behavior for a princess, either." "Well, yes. No, it isn't proper." "Nothing interesting seems to be proper," Cimarine said. "You might find things a little more interesting if you applied yourself, dear," Cimarine's mother said. "I doubt it," Cimarine muttered, but she knew better than to argue with her mother when she used that tone of voice. And that was the end of her magic lessons. The same thing happened over the Latin lessons from the court philosopher, and the cooking lessons from the castle chef, and the economics lessons from the court treasurer, and the juggling lessons from the court minstrel. Cimarine began to grow rather tired of the whole business. When she was 16 Cimarine summoned her fairy godmother. "Cimarine, my dear, this sort of thing really isn't done," the fairy said, fanning away the blue-scented smoke that had accompanied her appearance. People keep telling me that, Cimarine said. Then you should pay more attention to them, her fairy godmother said irritably. I'm not used to being hauled away from my tea without warning, and you aren't supposed to call me unless it's a matter of utmost importance to your life and future happiness. It is of the utmost importance to my life and future happiness, Cimarine said. Oh, very well then. You're a bit young to have fallen in love already. Still, you've always been a precocious child. Tell me about him. Cimarine sighed. It isn't a him. Enchanted is he, the fairy said with a spark of interest. A frog, perhaps? That used to be quite popular, but it seems to have gone out of fashion lately. Nowadays all the princes are talking birds or dogs or hedgehogs. No, no, I'm not in love with anyone. Well, then what exactly is your problem? The fairy godmother asked in exasperation. This, Cimarine gestured at the castle all around her. Embroidery lessons and dancing and in being a princess. My dear Cimarine, the fairy said, shocked. It is your heritage. It is boring. Boring? The fairy did not believe what she was hearing. Boring! I want to do things, not sit around all day and listen to the court minstrel make up songs about how brave Daddy is or how lovely his wife and daughters are. Nonsense, my dear. This is just a stage you're going through. You'll outgrow it soon, and you'll be glad you didn't do anything rash. Cimarine looked at her fairy godmother suspiciously. You've been talking to my parents, haven't you? Well, they do try to keep me up to date on what my godchildren are doing. I thought so, Cimarine said, and bade her fairy godmother a polite goodbye. A few weeks later, Cimarine's parents took her to a tourney in Satham by the mountains, the kingdom next over. Cimarine was quite sure that they were only taking her because her fairy godmother had told them that something had better be done about her, and soon. But she kept this opinion to herself. Anything was better than the endless rounds of dancing and embroidery lessons at home. But Cimarine realized her mistake as soon as they reached their destination, for the king of Satham by the mountains had a son. He was golden-haired, blue-eyed, and exceedingly handsome prince, whose duties appeared to consist entirely of dancing attendance on Cimarine. Isn't he handsome? Cimarine's lady-in-waiting sighed. Yes, Cimarine said without enthusiasm. Unfortunately, that's all he is. What do you mean? The lady-in-waiting asked with astonishment. He has no sense of humor. He isn't intelligent. He can't talk about anything except tourneys, and half of what he does say he gets wrong. I'm glad we're only staying here 3 weeks. I don't think I could stand to be polite to him much longer than that. But what about your engagement? The lady-in-waiting cried, horrified. What engagement? Cimarine said sharply. The lady-in-waiting tried to mutter something about a mistake, but Cimarine put her chin up in her best princess fashion and insisted on an explanation. Finally, the lady-in-waiting broke down. I overheard their majesties discussing it yesterday. She sniffled into her handkerchief. The stipulations and covenants and contracts and settlements have all been drawn up, and they're going to sign them the day after tomorrow and announce it on Thursday. I see, Cimarine said. Thank you for telling me. You may go. The lady-in-waiting left, and Cimarine went to see her parents. They were annoyed and a little embarrassed to find that Cimarine had discovered their plans, but they were still very firm about it. We were going to tell you tomorrow, when we signed the papers, her mother said. We knew you'd be pleased, dear, she said. She continued nodding. He's such a good-looking boy. I don't want to marry Prince Thorndale, Cimarine said. Well, it's not exactly a brilliant match, Cimarine's father said, frowning, but I didn't think you'd care how big his kingdom is. It's the prince I don't care for, Cimarine said. That's a great pity, dear, but it can't be helped, her mother said placidly. I'm afraid it isn't likely you'll get another offer. Then I won't get married at all. Both of her parents looked slightly shocked. My dear Cimarine, her father said, that is out of the question. You are a princess. It simply isn't done. I'm too young to get married. Your great-aunt Rose was married at 16, her mother pointed out. One really can't count all those years she was asleep under that dreadful fairy spell. I won't marry the Prince of Satham by the mountains, Cimarine said desperately. It isn't proper. What? Both of her parents said together. He hasn't rescued me from a giant, or an ogre, or freed me from a magic spell. Both of her parents looked uncomfortable. Well, no, Cimmerine's father said, but it's a bit late to start arranging it. We might be able to manage something. I don't think it's necessary, Cimmerine's mother said, and she looked reprovingly at Cimmerine. You've never paid attention to what was proper before, dear, and you can't stop now. Suitable or not, you will marry Prince Thorindel 3 weeks from Thursday. But, Mother, I'll send the wardrobe mistress to your room to start fitting your bride clothes, Cimmerine's mother said firmly, and that was the end of the conversation. Cimmerine decided to try a more direct approach. She went to see Prince Thorindel, and he was in the castle armory looking at swords. Good morning, Princess, he said when he finally noticed Cimmerine. Don't you think this is a lovely sword? Cimmerine picked it up. The balance is off. I believe you're right, Thorindel said after a moment's study. Pity, now I'll have to find another. Is there something I can do for you? Yes, said Cimmerine, you cannot marry me. What? Thorindel looked confused. You don't really want to marry me, do you? Cimmerine said coaxingly. Well, not exactly, Thorindel replied. I mean, in a way, that is... Oh, good, Cimmerine said, correctly interpreting this muddled reply as no, not at all. Then you'll tell your father you don't want to marry me? I couldn't do that, Thorindel said, shocked. It wouldn't be right. Why not? Cimmerine demanded crossly. Because, well, princes just don't do that. Then how are you going to keep from marrying me? I guess I won't be able to, Thorindel said after thinking hard for a moment. How do you like that sword over there, the one with the silver hilt? Cimmerine left in disgust and went out to the castle garden. She was very discouraged. It looked as if she was going to have to marry the Prince of Satham by the Mountains, whether she wanted it or not. I'd rather be eaten by a dragon, she muttered. That could be arranged, a voice from beside her left slipper said. Cimmerine looked down and saw a small green frog looking up at her. I beg your pardon? Did you speak? She asked. You don't see anyone else around, do ya? Said the frog. Oh, Cimmerine said. She'd never met a talking frog before. Are you an enchanted prince? She asked doubtfully. No, but I've met a couple of them, and after a while you pick a few things up, said the frog. Then why is it you want to be eaten by a dragon? My parents want me to marry Prince Thorindel, Cimmerine explained. And you don't want to? Sensible of you, the frog said. I don't like Thorindel. He used to skip rocks across the lake, and they always sank into my living room. I'm sorry, Cimmerine said politely. Well, said the frog, what are you going to do about it? Marrying Thorindel? I don't know. I've tried talking to my parents, but they won't listen, and neither will Thorindel. I didn't ask what you said about it, the frog snapped. I asked what you're going to do. 9 times out of 10, talking is a way of avoiding doing things. Well, what kind of things do you suggest? Cimmerine said, stung. You could challenge the prince to a duel, the frog suggested. He'd win, Cimmerine said. It's been 4 years since I've been allowed to do any fencing. You could turn him into a toad. I never got past invisibility in my magic lessons, Cimmerine said. Transformations are an advanced study. The frog looked at her disapprovingly. Can't you do anything? I can curtsy, Cimmerine said disgustedly. I know 17 different country dances, 9 ways to agree with an ambassador from Cathay without actually promising him anything, and 143 embroidery stitches. And I can make Cherry's Jubilee. Cherry's Jubilee? The frog asked, and snapped at a passing fly. The castle chef taught me before father made him stop, Cimmerine explained. The frog munched briefly, then swallowed and said, I suppose there's no help for it. You'll have to run away. Run away? Cimmerine said. I don't like that idea. Too many things could go wrong. You don't like the idea of marrying Prince Thorindel either, the frog pointed out. Maybe I can think of some other way to get out of getting married, the frog snorted. Such as? Cimmerine didn't answer, and after a moment the frog said, I thought so. Do you want my advice or not? Yes, please, Cimmerine said. After all, she didn't need to follow it. Go to the main road outside the city and follow it all the way from the mountains. And after a while, you'll come to a small pavilion made of gold, surrounded by trees made of silver with emerald leaves. Go straight past it without stopping, and don't answer if anyone calls out to you from the pavilion. Keep on until you reach a hovel, then walk straight up to the door and knock 3 times. And snap your fingers and walk inside. You'll find some people there who can help you out of your difficulties if you're polite about asking and they're in the right mood. And that's all. The frog turned abruptly and dove into the pool. Thank you very much, Simmarine called out after it. Finding it very odd advice indeed, she rose and went back to the castle. She spent the rest of the day being fitted and fussed over by ladies in waiting until she was ready to scream. By the end of the formal banquet, at which she had to sit next to Prince Thorindale and listen to endless stories of his battle prowess, Simmarine was more than ready to take the frog's advice. So late that night, when most of the castle was asleep, Simmarine bundled up 5 clean handkerchiefs and her best crown, and she dug out the notes she had taken during her magic lessons, and carefully cast a spell of invisibility. It seemed to work, but she was still very watchful as she sneaked out of the castle. After all, it had been a very long time since she practiced. And by morning Simmarine was well outside the city and visible again. Walking down the main road that led away from the mountains, it was hot and dusty, and she began to wish she'd brought a bottle of water instead of the handkerchiefs. Just before noon she spied a small grove of trees next to the road ahead of her, and it looked a cool and pleasant place to rest for a few minutes. So she hurried forward, and when she reached the grove, she saw that the trees were made of the finest silver, and their shining green leaves were huge emeralds. And in the center of the grove stood a charming pavilion that was made out of gold and hung with gold curtains. Simmarine slowed down and looked longingly at the cool green shade beneath the trees. Just then a woman's voice called out from the pavilion, "My dear, you look so tired and thirsty. Come sit with me and share my luncheon." The voice sounded so kind and coaxing that Simmarine took 2 steps forward to the edge of the road before she remembered the frog's advice. "Oh, no," she thought to herself, "I'm not going to be caught this easily," and she turned without saying anything and hurried down the road. A little farther she came to a tiny, wretched-looking hovel made out of cracked and weathered gray boards. The door hung slantwise on a broken hinge, and the whole building looked as though it was going to topple over at any moment. Simmarine stopped and stared at it doubtfully, but she had followed the frog's advice this far, and she thought it silly to stop now. She shook the dust from her skirts and put on her crown, so as to make a good impression. She marched right on up to the door, knocked 3 times, and snapped her fingers, just as the frog had told her. And then she pushed the door end. That is the last page of chapter 1. When we pick up next time, we'll read chapter 2, in which Simmarine discovers the value of a classical education and has some unwelcome visitors. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. Until I see you again, I hope you stay happy and safe. Goodbye, guys.